We don't care where your letterhead says you are. Your code, your data, your team, those were built in China, and that's ours. Almost nobody is dug into the mechanics. And it's the mechanics where it is going to really get genuinely surreal. What does the unwinding of this deal actually look like? When track records are short, when the legal infrastructure for accountability is weak, trust becomes the most important currency in the system. Trust is built on one thing: the belief that what someone tells you roughly corresponds to reality. All right, we've got a jam-packed recent time with a number of stories going on. We've taken a little bit of a hiatus, but we are back, and man, do we have a jam schedule of news, fraud, geopolitics, populist regulation, and a power grid that's quietly becoming one of the most important battlegrounds in Southeast Asia tech. None of them are simple. All of them matter. So let's get into it. So welcome back to Sea of Startups. I'm Kevin C., the seed stage VC at Indelible Ventures, and this is the podcast where we talk about what's actually happening in Southeast Asian startup ecosystem without the press release language. Today is a news episode. We're going to tackle 4 stories, 4 takes. I'll tell you what happened, what I think it actually means, and what it means for you if you're a founder, investor, or just someone trying to make sense of the region. So let's get into it. The first story that we're going to talk about is the one that's been dominating the headlines. And no, it's not necessarily purely Southeast Asia, but there is a play here with the Singapore linkage, and that is the Manus deal. So what happened? We've talked about the Manus deal in the past when Meta acquired them. But what happened is that China just killed Meta's acquisition of Manus. They basically said it needed to be unwound. And the wild part is the deal had already closed. So then now what? What is going to end up happening now? Well, backstory is back in December, Meta announced it was acquiring Manus, which is, for those who don't know, it's an AI agent startup that went viral in the early 2025. And it was essentially like the answer to deep research tools. And that acquisition was somewhere between $2 and $3 billion. So not a small one, not massive sort of OpenAI Anthropic scale. But it was a big deal, and it was a company that had moved out of China, became a Singapore-based holding company, China origin team, impressive tech, to be honest. And Meta wanted the agentic AI capabilities to plug into its platforms, compete with Google and OpenAI. Meta has been acquisitive. And basically what happened is China regulators said, no, not so fast. Actually, not at all. You're going to have to give it back. And that's what happened, 2 weeks ago? Essentially, Beijing Commission, I think it was National Development and Reform Commission, basically sent out a one-line statement blocking the deal and ordering both parties to unwind it. And the deal was already live. It was already closed. Money was dispersed. Employees had shifted over. Tech had been exchanged. And Manus's own website was already saying it was part of Meta. So China forced them to divorce mid-honeymoon. Now, the surface story is the US-China AI decoupling, and I think everyone's heard the geopolitical angle of this. And yes, that is real. But for Southeast Asia, the more important story is what it means for the Singapore washing playbook, essentially. And Singapore washing, if you haven't heard the term, is when a Chinese company relocates it. Well, I mean, it could really be any company, but it's kind of like a bit more associated with when Chinese company relocates its headquarters to Singapore to distance itself and unlock U.S. capital and Western talent and avoid some of the restrictions, let's call it, that may end up being associated otherwise. And Manus did this exactly. It was after that they moved the office, restructured the entity, basically cut tie with the China operations, shut down the Beijing team, and by letter of law, they were a Singapore company. They even got a legendary US VC to put a pretty sizable amount of money in. And, China looked at that and said, we don't care where your letterhead says you are. Your code, your data, your team, those were built in China, and that's ours. Before this ruling, Singapore was, honestly, the de facto safe harbor for uh, any deep tech founders wanting to play in a global market, and especially for those coming out of China and wanting to be global from day one without the hindrance of the geopolitical reality that exists. But perhaps that playbook is dead now. If they're willing to reach into a completed acquisition and pull the plug, maybe that's changing the playbook. And it does leave a lot of questions. And I haven't seen anybody actually reporting on the rest of the story. And I mean, every outlet covered the headline. Almost nobody has dug into the mechanics. And it's the mechanics where it is going to really get genuinely surreal. What does the unwinding of this deal actually look like? So if we start with the money, somewhere between $2 and $3 billion. I can't remember the acquisition price. I should have had it in my notes. But multi-billions have already flowed through to Manus's investors, and then probably through to those investors' investors. VCs distribute capital, LPs receive it. That money is already downstream. Does it get clawed back? Can it even be clawed back? From whom? By what legal mechanism? When you start thinking about the country jurisdictions that start layering into this. Benchmark was an investor in Manus pre-acquisition. What happens if Benchmark says, "Hey, we're a U.S. firm under U.S. law, and we're not giving back the money from a deal that was fully compliant at the time of closing"? Who enforces that? Does China have to go to the U.S. in order to argue it there? They don't have jurisdiction over the U.S. domiciled fund, so does China then go after Meta instead? Or, one of the things that has been talked about is, does Meta just absorb the loss and eat the $2 billion? I mean, they basically generate that in like 2 weeks of free cash flow. So do they just kind of shrug their shoulders and say, well, too bad? It is a standing question. Then, of course, there's the technology problem. If the deal is getting unwound, Manus's engineering team has been embedded inside of Meta for weeks now. That's already started the ball rolling. That can't actually be simply turned around and unwound. They've had access to Meta's systems, Meta's code base, Meta's internal research, and Meta has had access to theirs. How do you put that genie back into the bottle? How do you reverse knowledge transfer? You can return source code files. You cannot return what engineers learn from each other by being in the office together and sharing work. And then there are the people, of course. Manus team members relocated to Singapore, some presumably to the US, perhaps as part of the acquisition. Did they get sent back? What does that look like in practice? You can't physically move people against their will. So what is the coercion? What is the immigration rules? This is not necessarily just a simple, neat stack of documents you file to reverse a transaction. These are people's lives. So what is going to end up happening in relation to that? And I just haven't seen the analysis around that. And maybe it's still in process. Maybe they're fighting it. So another question arises out of this. Did Meta actually screw up? Or does Meta actually not care at all? Here's the question that I think is quite an interesting one, and the one that's getting the least airtime is, did Meta make a mistake, or did they know this was a risk, move fast anyways, and just, kind of rolled the dice on it? Because there are two very different stories depending on the answer. Story one, Meta's M&A team genuinely believed that Manus had restructured as a Singapore entity, severed its China operations, and received U.S. legal sign-off. The deal was clean. They did the work. They got the opinions. They closed, and then China moved the goalpost by blocking a deal post-completion, something that is almost no precedent in international M&A. In that story, maybe Meta is a victim of regulatory overreach. But story two, Meta knew China was reviewing the deal, knew there was a non-trivial risk of intervention, and decided that the potential upside, getting the Manus technology and team embedded before any order could be enforced, maybe they thought that was worth the bet. In that story, Meta was essentially racing against the regulator, and now they have to act like they're cooperating with the unwind while quietly ensuring that the actual IP transfer has already happened. And honestly, I don't know which story is true, but I will tell you this. If I'm Zuckerberg and I've already paid $2 billion for a team that's now been working inside of my company for weeks, I'm not in a huge rush to make the unwind go smoothly. A slow unwind is a better outcome than a fast one. Or maybe I'm completely misreading it. Maybe it didn't actually work out, so they're going to see it as like a saving grace and they can just rip the Band-Aid and blame it on the regulators. But, you know, it could go a variety of ways. Could there potentially be a complicated legal process that drags out? If they do want to go slow, that's not necessarily the worst thing. Try and argue it, see how long it can be dragged out. But, if you go by their public statement, which in all honesty, it's a public statement, they're a public company. So of course, like grain of salt sort of thing. But their public statement said, quote, "The transaction complied fully with applicable law. We anticipate an appropriate resolution." I mean, it's a number of words without really actually saying anything. It's a super diplomatic non-answer. It says absolutely nothing, which might be exactly the point that they're going after. Say nothing and just kind of ride the wave. Now, what about Singapore? Here's the other party in this that's been conspicuously quiet, which is Singapore. So a Chinese regulator just reached into a transaction involving Singapore domiciled company and told it to unwind. Singapore's government has said essentially nothing in relation to this. No pushback, no statement defending its regulatory sovereignty. No, actually, Manus is a Singapore company under Singapore law, and we have something to say about this. Nothing. Now, to be charitable, Singapore is in a delicate position. So should they actually say anything? And most people I talk to say no. It does not want to be the battleground for U.S.-China tensions. They don't want to get into the middle of this. Its entire value proposition as a financial and business hub depends on remaining palatable to both sides, to be honest. So staying neutral and staying out of it, staying quiet might be a calculated choice. But the silence has a cost. I mean, if Singapore domiciled companies can be subject to foreign regulatory authority by virtue of where their founders were born or where their code was originally written, and Singapore essentially accepts that without objection, then what exactly is the value of that halo of Singapore incorporation for any founder coming from outside? Lots of questions still unanswered. Who actually has to give money back and to whom? Will Meta fight the unwind or quietly cooperate? What legal framework does China even have to enforce this on non-Chinese entities? I think this could either be a complete nothing, and it's just going to fizzle and disappear and nobody's ever going to talk about it again. But if it does actually end up playing out and ends up requiring any sort of maneuvering, I think it could be an interesting one to watch, and it could play out over months. We'll see. Could go either way. And for founders in the region, the message is kind of clear. There's no neutral ground, I guess, in this U.S.-China AI war. Are we going to see other countries starting to try and play the same angle and say, sovereignty of technology that is built in our country by our citizens, even if you relocate for fundraising potential and potential acquisition, et cetera, that they're going to reach across and try and unwind it. The leverage points, it could end up being a signal. That said, I do have to close this topic on one point, which is most countries have legal frameworks around protected industries in regards to the percent of foreign ownership, in regards to foreign acquisitions. That part is not unusual, not specific to the geopolitics. Most countries have them. This just is an extension of it when the company re-domiciles and ends up having a few degrees of separation after the fact, and this sort of long arm that's pulling it back. So certainly one to watch. I'll be keen. We'll see whether or not there's anything worth updating down the road and in the future. And with your projection set, you can run variance analysis, stay ahead of any shortcoming or overachievement so that you can adjust in real time. Need to look forward, you can build out your rolling forecast. As the actuals update, you have new and improved forecasts. Have fundraising plans in the future? Build out your forecasted cap table. Understand what metrics you need to hit those valuation targets. And last but not least, all those board reports, investor reports, fundraising, financial projections, all exportable, all buildable, all in one place. Now, second story is talking about the giant fraud case that finally got resolution, which, for background on this. So first off, it just happened last week that the court in Indonesia sentenced the eFishery founder to 9 years in prison. The former VP of finance also got 9 years. Another VP got 7, and the charges were embezzlement and money laundering. And this is the conclusion of what became one of Southeast Asia's most painful startup stories. It was for a long time the darling of the ecosystem, the feel-good unicorn, agri-tech, fish farmers, impact, smart feeders. It was a founder that came out of nowhere, became something massive. It tick marked a lot of the sort of idealism boxes for a lot of the investors, and it was the kind of stories you'd put in a fund deck to explain why Southeast Asia matters. But it all fell apart when the founder himself admitted in an interview to Bloomberg that it had all been fabricated, not a rounding error, not an optimistic projection. It was all fabricated, and this was admitted in an interview. And yet it still took a long time for this case to actually close. Now, mind you, legal process, there's due process, whatever. Um, but anyway, so the numbers. So the company apparently had told investors it generated $752 million in revenue and had like 16 million in profit. The actual numbers were a fraction of that, like not even like a small difference. It wasn't 700 plus. It was like 150 something, and they didn't make a profit. They made a massive loss. They were losing money. They reported 52. They made 157. That's not a bad quarter. That's pure fiction. Total investor losses somewhere north of $300 million, including big names like SoftBank, Temasek out of Singapore, Quap out of Malaysia, and they're likely going to get back 10 cents on the dollar, a fraction. They laid off most of the workforce, and it's effectively ceased operation. It's been painful. It's been very, very painful. Um, Years Some say it still doesn't feel enough. Prosecutors wanted more. Defense will probably appeal. And I'll be honest, when I think about the founders who spent years building genuine companies in agritech, watching eFishery pull in SoftBank money and Temasek money and set the benchmark valuations for the whole sector. 9 years, I mean, it kind of feels like a bare minimum. There needs to be a signal that this scale of fraud, which is pure and outright, there's no sort of I think there was a statement that said, we only did it to survive. $300 million is not to survive. If it's really about survival, then it'd probably be like tens of thousands or maybe 100,000 at most. That you stretch the truth a little bit in order to get a grant program or that angel investor, not $300 million. That is not surviving. That is grift, in my opinion. But, an entire board sat above this company, right? Multiple rounds of institutional due diligence supposedly happened. Big name investors, auditors, like big four name auditors, shows how much auditors are worth, I guess. So, I mean, either the due diligence was inadequate or the pressure to deploy capital was just so intense that people were incentivized to believe numbers that shouldn't have passed a basic sanity check. Neither answer is good, and neither answer ends with the founder not going to jail. Neither goes with him not going to jail. So, it is what it is. This is not just a story about one bad actor, to be honest with you. Southeast Asia is closing the chapter on its largest startup fraud case, yes. And I want to be clear about something. This is a chapter, not the book. Because fraud, and I mean this in the broadest sense, is not rare in this ecosystem, unfortunately. And it's not rare in any ecosystem. I don't want to harp on Southeast Asia, but it is true about Southeast Asia. And this case is an extreme version of something that exists on a spectrum. Now, mind you, FTX, Theranos, you can go through the list of large-scale frauds that happen in the U.S. Just pick up a copy of the 30 Under 30 and point your finger and you'll land on a fraud. But, at one end, we're talking about criminal fabrication of financials at scale. At the other end, things that happen every single week across the region that would never see a courtroom, but absolutely fall within the spirit of intentional deception for financial advantage. And that is the definition of fraud. It is an intentional deception for financial benefit or advantage. And how many times have we seen vanity metrics dressed up as traction? Customer counts that include churned users, GMV figures that include transactions that were never paid, pipeline presented as revenue, pilots that are really free trials, letters of intent treated like signed contracts in an investor deck. None of those things are the same as eFishery, but all of them are on the same continuum. They're all deceptions in order to gather a financial advantage. And it's not only founders that are culpable of doing these sort of things. Investors do it too. References given for portfolio companies that are more marketing than honest assessment. Fund performance figures that cherry pick which investments to include. And this is a key one, claims about value add that have never been tested. The ecosystem has integrity problems and that run in multiple directions. And why this actually matters for the region is here's the thing. Here's the thing about high uncertainty markets, and Southeast Asia is absolutely a high uncertainty market. When information is hard to verify, when track records are short, when the legal infrastructure for accountability is weak, trust becomes the most important currency in the system. Trust is built on one thing: the belief that what someone tells you roughly corresponds to reality. And when that belief erodes, when investors start assuming that every founder is telling them the most optimistic possible version of the truth, and every founder starts assuming every investor is overstating their value add, the whole system gets more expensive, more friction, more time wasted, more deals that don't get done because nobody trusts anyone enough to move fast. A high integrity environment is a high output environment. That's not platitude, it's an economic reality. When you can take people at their word, you move faster. You price risk more accurately. You allocate capital better. The countries and ecosystems that figure this out, that build the norms and the accountability structures that make claims verifiable, those are the ones that win over in the long run. And eFishery should be a forcing function, not just for tighter due diligence, though yes, every investor in this region needs to be doing more primary research and less trusting of management-provided numbers, but for a broader reckoning with the question of what kind of ecosystem we're building here. Every claim requires verification. No exceptions for founders like you, no exceptions for markets you're excited about, no exceptions for stories that are too good to be true, and especially those. The governance reckoning in Southeast Asia VC is real, and it's happening. eFishery won't be the last. Investry is still in the courts. Makram case, which, that's completely different. But the fact that it's happening at all tells you how much scrutiny the ecosystem is under and the things that are going on as such. For founders, this is what happens when you conflate the story with the numbers. For investors, this is what happens when you can conflate conviction with verification. For the ecosystem, we get the standards we're willing to enforce. Let's tie a bow on that. We can follow the story if it ends up panning out. Hopefully, we won't see another big fraud for a while. We've got a couple other stories that we're going to touch on, and I'm going to move kind of quickly through them. And I did want to touch on how Indonesia just capped their ride-hailing commissions. And this is a tough one because, there's a lot of drivers that are out there and depend upon ride-hailing in Indonesia. We see the motorbikes zip-zapping all over the place for deliveries, for rides, for this, for that. They're capping it now at 8% commission, down from 20, which certainly benefit for the drivers. Don't want to undersell that, but to put this in context, GoTo has been burning money like crazy, and then it finally posts its first ever profit, a milestone that they've been chasing for years. And now in comes this and says, okay, we're going to eat into whatever that achievement of profitability is. They're going to comply. Grab, which also operates there, is going to end up complying. Grab, fortunately, a lot of their profitability comes from other country markets. But nonetheless, it's going to be painful and question mark on whether or not it sets a precedent that any other market will look at it and say, let me see. But one thing's for sure, it is going to hurt GoTo without a doubt. They've been teetering and fragile for a long time. And when you look at it, you spend a decade burning capital to reach your first profit. Then the government comes along and says, give it to the driver. Congratulations. Will they still be around? Is this going to be a tipping point that drives the Grab GoTo merger? Don't know. It's not a small impact on the citizenry, for sure. It's going to hurt the platform margins, but the platform without the driver is just an app with nowhere to go. Maybe those take rates were too high to begin with. Maybe they need to figure out how to better leverage the scale that they're getting. Maybe there's a lot more there. if they end up putting better processes in place. But nonetheless, it'll be interesting to see. Government has they have the leverage. This was a big move, so definitely see something to look for that and see what the long-term impact on ride-hailing industry in Indonesia is going to be, and whether or not there's residual impact as the rest of the governments around Southeast Asia look at it and say, well, maybe we should be adjusting those commissions and resetting the caps as well. Last story, and then we'll wrap up for this episode. I do want to talk about data center energy crunch. A few days ago, a company called DPS Resources, a Malacca-based conglomerate that until recently was primarily in furniture manufacturing, property development, somehow got a MOU with Alibaba affiliate to explore building a $1.1 billion AGI data center in Malacca. Don't know how this company, any of that, 150 to 180 megawatts, sizable. And so the Alibaba entity is basically handling the operations and brings the compute demand, which makes sense. DPS provides the land, the power, the infrastructure. That I guess that kind of fits for them being local. And this is an interesting point for a bigger story, because this company pivoting to join forces with Alibaba on data centers is not really an anomaly. It is a good illustration of what is happening across Malaysia right now and the data center boom. Everyone wants a piece of the data center gold rush. And the question most people aren't asking out loud, I guess, or loudly enough, is, does Malaysia actually have the power to sustain it? Now, let's get a couple of numbers that I pulled out, and hopefully all of these are accurate. The numbers that I pulled out is that the TNB, the Tenaga Nasional, Malaysia's national electricity utility, they've got a pipeline of 7,500 megawatts across 56 data center projects. Total committed capacity within these facilities when these facilities are built out, 4,500 megawatts. Current actual load from data centers right now, 850. So the load currently drawn is roughly 850. The pipeline that has been approved is 7,500. The gap between those numbers is going to close, and it's going to close fast, because data center load in Malaysia has already surged sixfold since early 2024. The facilities are being built, the servers are being racked, the draw is coming, and exactly the same time, Malaysia is scheduled to retire 6,400 megawatts of coal-fired generation capacity between 2029 and 2031. Plants at Kapar, plants at Tanjung Bin, old, dirty, but reliable base load power going offline right as the data center demand wave hits. Now, to cover those retirements and meet rising demand, it seems like Malaysia is going to need roughly 12,000 megawatts of new generation by 2031. Now, that is a task, which brings me to something that is right now unfolding and is not getting a ton of coverage, which is that the Energy Commission has an open tender called NuGen 26 for new gas-fired generation capacity to come online between 2029 and 2031. Bids are closing soon, 8 weeks from now. It's not a routine procurement. The Energy Commission has said peak electricity demand in peninsular Malaysia is expected to exceed 28,000 megawatts by 2026. Some of these numbers are starting to bounce all over. I think this is including overall, and the reserve margin, the buffer between peak and total available capacity, is already approaching the safety red line of 15%. If that buffer disappears, you get brownouts, you get load shedding. For data centers running AI workloads that cannot tolerate interruptions, that is catastrophic. NuGen 26 is Malaysia racing to build generation capacity before the demand wall hits. So good thing. The fact that we're talking about gas plants, not solar, not nuclear, gas, I mean, that tells you something about the timeline pressure, I guess. Maybe renewables take too long. You need dispatchable power that can be turned on and off on demand. So you build gas. Malaysia has gas. And you figure out the energy transition later. Um, so here's where it gets real for everyone in Malaysia right now as well, which is uh, TNB has already introduced an automatic fuel adjustment mechanism last year, which means that global oil and gas price changes feed directly into Malaysian electricity bills within, say, 30 days. No buffer, no smoothing. When Brent crude goes up because the Strait of Hormuz is disrupted, the electricity bill is going to follow within a month, say. The IEA has described the current disruption from the Iran conflict as the largest shock in the history of global oil market. Malaysia is a net oil importer. Its grid runs 75% on coal and gas. The rebate on Malaysian electricity bills has already been shrinking month on month. This is not an abstract geopolitical story. This is data centers in Johor, approved and built on the premise of cheap Malaysian electricity, now facing a grid that is tightening, tariffs that are rising, and a government that is going to be under pressure from both sides, the hyperscalers demanding cheap power, and ordinary consumers asking why their bills are going up. And here's where I want to push past the infrastructure story to the uncomfortable question underneath it. Who actually benefits from all of this? When a company like DPS is providing the land and power, Alibaba affiliate brings the computing demand and runs the operations. The data doesn't belong to Malaysia. The AI models don't belong to Malaysia. The IP doesn't belong to Malaysia. There's a paper out of the Asia Society that makes the point plainly. If you've read it, we can link in the comments. Data centers create the lowest number of jobs per square foot of any major facility type. Thousands of construction jobs during the build, then roughly 200 operational staff when it's running. Research and engineering roles, the high-value ones, are largely filled by foreign workers. So Malaysia is providing the real estate, the utilities, the grid infrastructure, the environmental cost, and the hyperscales are keeping the value. There's an analogy to the resource curse here, the phenomenon where countries rich in natural resources end up poor because the extraction happens without building local capability. Is Malaysia doing a digital version of that? Trading cheap electricity, cheap land, and grid stability for the privilege of hosting someone else's compute? Now, to be fair, the government is aware of the tension. The AI-only filter on new approvals is an attempt to ensure what gets built transfers capability, not just fills land. You do have partnerships that are coming in. There's a lot of government funding committed to sovereign AI cloud, but the gap between the rhetoric and the reality of who captures value from this infrastructure boom is still very wide, to be honest with you. The tender that I mentioned closes in 8 weeks. Whatever gets built in response to it will define Malaysia's energy story for a decade. Founders, investors, and operators in this region should be paying very close attention. So there you have it. 4 stories, one theme underneath, all of them if you want to look for it. The rules are being written. Who controls AI? Who controls capital flows? Who gets a fair share of gig economy value? Who owns the infrastructure the future runs on? These aren't settled questions. They're live negotiations between governments, between companies, between regions. Southeast Asia is not a passive observer in any of this. Every one of these stories has a local dimension that the global tech press consistently underweights. That's why this show exists. If you got something out of this episode, share it with someone who should be paying more attention. And if you've got a take on any of these stories that I got wrong, I want to hear about it. Find me on LinkedIn. I'm Kevin. This is Sea of Startups. See you next time. And that does it for this episode of Sea of Startups. If you've enjoyed what you've been listening to, please give it a like, give it a review, subscribe to our channel. A little bit of feedback goes a long way in allowing us to keep on putting out these kind of episodes.